Beauty is perceived. If beauty is to be perceived, the heart must go, as in the soul must move, it must be activated. Arousal is one way to move the heart, however, so is agitation. In either one of these avenues, an elicitation of reflex is being caused. Repetitive motions stand the capacity to set the soul off to get a grasping sense for beauty, as does the magnetism of gravity's pull, restlessness, perturbations, being in the process of losing moisture, remembrances and their counterparts, forgettances, short-temperedness, divisions, what a lascivious imagination reveals, recognition of what we are losing in acuity for, and focusing on our points of origin. Constant duplication of action is a crucial strong point of a full-fledged soul. Some would say this pattern of behavior is telling of a problem with regards to short-term memory span. Some way, somehow, we don't connect. We're telling the same tale over and over again due to not recalling having said it and having said it quite frequently. Repetitive duplications, some experts have said, are signs of a withering, rotting brain. Seniored folk constantly duplicate their action, sometimes without any sort of fluctuation whatsoever. It's as if they know that mannerisms dictate chances. Have you ever interrupted a loquacious relative in one of his snooze-written tales? Maybe you said something like, "We've already heard you say that. Can't you tell us anything else?" Only to have this relative say something like, "And what's the problem? I like telling this story." There is delight in constant duplication, even if from the outer regions it all looks and sounds like total batshit insanity. There is something to be told about that soulful relative who doesn't permit the eyes and ears of a youth-filled, spry spirit to judge the qualities that could only be found there, off, in some distant time. Some soulful beings know the rapturous feeling that comes from finding place in a style. Constant duplication of action conjoins what would be the aged and the uninitiated. Both of the members of this group partake of the sense gained in each experience. So how come bother with the idea that duplication of action is a negative? How come we don't bother to think it to be a necessitative component of the prolific mythic imagination? Why not consider the need for the prolific mythic imagination to engage in play-like fantasy to be a dire sustenance? Isn't it the case that the inheritors of culture have their wisdom given to them via the consistency contained within duplication of action, specifically that which their predecessors engaged in while storytelling? Consistency of certain kinds of actions, no matter how mundane we may think them to be, are nonetheless more than important. This constant duplication of action that we find ourselves in seems to speak more toward how life is kept alive than it does about our inability to listen. Isn't it a rare phenomena to frequently run into little kids who are obsessed by hearing the same tales in exactly the same manner over and over again? How come the existence of that want? Maybe, just maybe, the first etchings and markings of our predecessors' efforts were committed so when the tales were retold to a newer posterity, they would be told without any sort of deviation whatsoever. Rather, instead of any sort of deviation whatsoever, how about a means and a way by which we can ensure preciseness? It's been said before that continuity seems stronger than eternity. Properly proportioned consistency of action carried out duplicatively fulfills the urge to feel what familiarity is about. This urge is stronger than the urge to want to be devoid of any sort of knowledge whatsoever. Whenever the same story gets told, at exactly the same time, around the exact time of year when the entire family is gathered around of how the power went out and the family gathered to do what needed to be done so a lit home could be provided, is it really about the same old boring story being repeated over and over again? How come the duplication of the same? What is tale trying to tell us about itself? In duplication, it's revealed unto us how customs work knowledge of body. In duplication, we view how soul accounts. The tale told by your favorite uncle is somehow filled with excitement. When told by your least favorite uncle, the duplication of the exact same tale is unbearable. Perhaps we grow weary due to our being hung up on only receiving the true points in the matter that occurred. We fail to give room to the element at work playing through the duplication of the tale. Each time a favorite uncle speaks or an unfavored uncle speaks, it's an opportunity for a style to be born. Is the style going to come through in the emphasis of home, collaborativeness, teamwork, resoluteness of the family? These out of our control circumstances, nobody's fault whatsoever moments could serve as points of origin for future victories of the group to be rallied upon. Backdrops are provided, minutiae can be extracted about why certain things are what they are throughout the lapse of the day within the family, neighborhoods, communities, because of these tales being told by one uncle versus the other. Through the method of duplicating tales, soul labors out what's important from our perceptions of what we classify as the same old, same old. The phrase, nothing lasts forever, is a bullshit lie. Just try and exit from our need for continuity. Has there ever been a time where someone didn't come across the gained sense of satisfaction from having heard their favorite story being told over and over again? Our need to know that some things do last longer than time is, well, stronger than time. It isn't just about the consistency we continue to draw from each duplicated action, nor is it only about the familiarity we grow accustomed to, although that is a major portion of it. It is also about isolating the particularity which stands in a class on its own out. The French philosopher Gauss Louis René Deloise remarks that the more consistently we duplicate an action, the more the particularity is being isolated out. In each retelling of the story, the special qualities contained within each story parade themselves. It's an exponentiation that is occurring with every duplication being carried out. Duplicated action amplifies the occasion by honoring its God-given genuineness. This is distinct from copying exactly. Exact copies dull or even at times dilute entirely the particularities within each occasion. Though many copies are available, something about the first from which all others stemmed tends to lose its luster, its attraction, with each available copy. Gills notes to us that duplicated action in a seemingly ridiculous way predisposes us to the God-givenness of what is being duplicated. In essence, not just seniored folk, but children who are mesmerized with hearing the same things again and again, are just as responsible for maintaining the inextinguishableness of particularity contained within each duplicated action. We become the means by which prototypical sustenances run through the cosmos, the very same kind of sustenances that grant moments their enduring significances. Aside from how irritated we may be in hearing a least favorite uncle speak, there is still solace to be found with each prototypical inculcation. We don't long for something new or even desire differences. Instead, rather, we'd like to remain in a sort of boundless, timeless, familiar-like quality. There is a permanence within the fabric of cosmic time, of a balancing kind of nature to our psyche. Something about the repetitious act of telling the same stories, no matter how obnoxious we may find them to be, impresses this upon us. It doesn't matter how many times we hear our relatives regurgitate the news that the markets are rationing tissue paper, because as long as we repeat the fact that the cosmos have existed longer than tissue paper, longer than tissue paper has, we can begin to manage that will be more than okay. It seems trivial to say, part of it is. However, nonetheless, these are ways of reminding ourselves of the permanence we have with the cosmos. It's a means by intimating that kind of knowledge. What is that uncle offering us in the retelling of those stories he loves to tell? Could he be offering us samples for the permanent? Our ancestral predecessors served this important function. With every iteration of every story they loved to tell, they remind us of that old idea by the philosopher Vico set forth by him as ricorso. Sigmund Freud associated duplication with death. It was his belief that the motivational tendency was a tendency supplanted in biology. This tendency's initial projection is to reinstate a prior state. The duplicated tale characterizes a portion of our previous state. In the act of duplication, the tale telling removes, even if only gradually, forces that subdue our history. The act of duplication also alleviates perturbation and extends imagination. This innate motivational tendency desires, according to Freud, to place us in a condition of true inorganic potential. Urges that cause us to duplicate the specificity of certain stories are signs of a deadening factor at work. Soul is having some work done in this occasion, in this instance. Our current vision of repetitious acts, due to primarily because of mainstream psychology's failure to view soul in its line of study, is one of biological matter en route toward a prime condition metaphysically to be achieved, a sort of standby condition. Our least favorite uncle's bothered response when we express our annoyances in being subjugated to his duplicated acts is proof of his drive to his optimal zone. Sharing the same old sustains his vitality for life. Some way, somehow, duplicativeness blocks the essence of time from flowing through. Where is the fluctuation in our uncle's variation when he tells us the same story? Neither the story or the storyteller modify, maintaining vitality and deriving gratification from this natural tendency toward arriving at an optimal zone of approximation becomes primary in the tempo of duplicating a story. For the sake of illustration, let's just say we extracted duplication out of the storyteller. For imaginative purposes, let's say we were to take out the natural tendency within a person to a force of power contained inside a story. In other words, from what would be contemporary psychology to anachronistic customs. In such hypotheticals, we would have to acknowledge to certain degrees that there are specific stories which impress themselves onto the prototype of orator. Without question, most definitely an orator of aged like quality. Somehow, someone who customarily portions himself on behalf of our forebears. There is an essence in what we would otherwise differ to as myth, which is separate from any notion which drives us to these inorganic states of optimal zones of approximation. The instinct toward that is within the orator. Upon configuring such potentiating sustenance into some sort of mythological schema, this material calls out something to us which must be spoken of separately from the orator, something which does indeed prevent age from seeping through, sustaining the vitality of the psyche. Due to the meticulous nature of duplication without error, some of us have gone to extreme measures in our attempts to obtain new breath from either timeless lovers of wisdom or contemporary ones. just for the sake of extracting it out from platitudinous. What could be more precise than finding just the right pitch of frequency to fit a sentence? Nevertheless, the satisfaction of expressing human creative ingenuity or the application of it, along with the effectiveness of communicating with the higher being, the ineffable we sense in ceremony, and the potency of temperament rely on seemingly absurd, meticulous duplications that appear on their own to be meritless. It's intuitive to picture youth in some association with a rising steady incline of some sort. Likewise, it's intuitive to picture aging in some association with a falling decline of some sort. Within these two, there's a present variation in our schema when we go from one to the other. The phases that follow infancy are all connotated with an enlargening of some sort. It isn't until later aging occurs that the body begins to wither in effect. A natural force we are all exposed to begins to have its incremental toll on our bodies. Magnetas begins to drag us closer and closer toward its core. Glit no longer provides us luster through the proverbial avenues, relentless pursuits of goal achieving, the feeling like we are rising or ascending to acquire some type of social states, or rather some social status, professional occupation, the brackets that we want to be under. These no longer attract us. They no longer glimmer. The same set of eyes we would use to distinguish what could be required of us to achieve whatever feeling, whatever place to fit in, are used to find enchantment elsewhere. Instead of being surrounded by the blockbuster groups of people or the clusters of stars here on Earth, we are with the great drag downward, inward, to our place of origin's core. Our physical morphology changes and we see them in our eyes and the bags underneath them, indicating downward. Second chins come along as if gravity was holding a place for them all along. Pot bellies are more like bellies hanging downward. Even surgically modified gluteus maximuses aren't impervious to this natural and organic force of nature, no matter how well the surgeon who performed them might be. More and more parts of our bodies want to go downward. As we trolley along our days, maybe in leisure, maybe not, our focus becomes centered toward the ground, as if not to lose sight of the Earth's core, that we might lose our balance along the way downward. Japanese elders not only bow out of respect to indicate thoughtful consideration, they also do so to begin cushioning themselves into the frame gravity is morphing them out. In Greek myth, we have the image of Atlas holding the weight of the world. His fit physique, no matter how well he's kept it, still isn't strong enough to carry the entire weight of the world on his shoulders. His neck is strained, forced to look downward with a seriousness of expression on his face. We've grown accustomed to thinking old is supposed to be bent over, hunched, distorted, undesirable. We look at the changes our aging bodies sustain but become predisposed to neglecting its psychological indications. If we do acquire a piece of intelligence, it is only that we are moving toward the grave. Dug into our contextual reference of grave are several key illustrations. The puzzling force of nature we recognize as gravity, which pulls matter to Earth's core, gravitas, which is associated with dignity, seriousness, solemnity, grandesque, and sobriety. Grave as in where our bodies are laid to rest, or used to describe the seriousness of one's circumstance. And lastly, gravid, meaning something which is full of meaning. Anxieties in later years could be about matters making grave our inevitable destinations, specifically death. They could also be about the richness associated with the circumstance we find ourselves in regarding this natural force, the seriousness of its tendency of the seriousness of its inevitability. For some, this natural inclination downward has a tendency of sparking uneasiness. This focus of attention toward uneasiness increases the likelihood that we'll be unfocused on seriously dire matters, as for an example, the profundity with which a composed, even aged ancestral soul is supposed to be stacked with. Somehow we don't question who is supposed to shoulder the weight gravity pulls down on us. The old are supposed to. We seldom ever think twice about who qualifies as old. We hardly ever question the characteristic of biological years being almost an autonomic response we are inclined to look for in our judgment as to whether someone is old or not. We hardly ever think about the timeless essence a majority of us carry with us since before birth, and how well someone may be exuding those timeless qualities despite not having many biological years. No matter the case, nature sprouts the old downward. The deeper we head into our biological years, our world's thresholds tend to become shorter and shorter. As much as we'd like to think, with our spatial dimensions enlarging, our focus tends to move to where we find ourselves supplanted, in the locale of our communities. We find ourselves drawn back to the center of our city's core. The pull of this magneticism, which moves us to a core, is like a call home. Chances, possibilities, probabilities, what could or ought to be tends to just go away. What remains and stands left to sit or anchor ourselves down on is fitting into our place. This settling into our place is the soul's natural tendency to have what's relevant and valuable to it. Where we house our valuables isn't just inside of the privacy of our own homes. The instinct that drives us toward what matters most, in essence, where we ultimately want to and need to be, or where we absolutely have to be, takes us much, much further than where we ultimately are laid to rest. If we are to come into contact with different parts of our character, different kinds of our attitudes about the pull of this force of nature are going to have to be adopted. There is so much life happening there, underneath the ground, where most of us don't think twice about being laid to rest. It just happens a different type of way. Many of our mythological characters journeyed below to the world underneath to learn how to grasp a sense for originality, one that couldn't be obtained anywhere else. In other circumstances, strong heroes up above on earthly planes were exiled to journey underneath just so they can strengthen themselves to take on natures of reality that weren't material in their substance. The sensitivity of one's ears grow more acute in their sensibility in having traversed through lands below. We are left to face altogether different kinds of structures that bear an influence on the planes we normally occupy. The magnetic pull downward is pivotal to the qualities of power which grant characters their timeless permanences. We see this change in a character when they are accompanied by a dark solemnity which is enshrouded in a cloak of illusory mystery. Every now and a while we come across a character whose time spent away from home shows in his demeanor upon coming home. In other words, what would be the battle-tested, exhausted figure coming home to spouse and children. Some wed the influences we can't see for relatively short amounts of time. Our capability to dwell beneath the ground inculcates the qualities which enable us to remain, even after our time has passed. The mass necessary for an ancestorial personage to sustain itself throughout time amplifies itself within this process, serving the world by being merit filled, along with using that merit to mold out its being, necessitates getting under it. The great drag downward is a pull, a psychological pull toward the role of the aged ones, the contributors, difference makers, the preservators. It is also a pull about steward and mentor. The apprehension is one of what has come before us, the dead, or from what has existed, transposed itself into what can't be seen with the naked eyes, but still continues to have an enlivening effect in our lives with its capacity for impacting our lives. This dead, which is being spoken of, appears in our lives in times of dire need, most especially and particularly when we are improperly placed. In those moments, the dead rise and become alive. Along with that experience comes counsel and a sort of bracing of one's own in their own time-space dimensional reality. The dead have wealth. How else would they be capable of appearing again and again in our lives all throughout history? Perhaps part of their ability to know how to do so lies in their ability to be grasped, sensed, in other terms. The dead of which we speak of is the influence in psyche's gravitational pull. Archaic articulations of the realms beneath hold that in this world there isn't anything concrete. What exists are only depictions, portrayals, representations, apparitions, figments, mirages, hallucinations, fumes, gases, obscurations of lower atmosphere, and sensations of the mind that occur to us in sleep states. The world beneath us cannot be spotted, only intuited with impressions, inklings, guesses, estimations, surmises, notions, and suppositions based on limited intel and feelings. This world beneath us is left for us to stand on the essence of words, the sounds within the words of our phrases, the spirits behind the intentions of the thoughts being portrayed. The soul has weight when its insight shared breaches through to the center of matter, making revelation possible. These more serious matters, filled with their own types of cosmic constellations, don't go promoted throughout the day. The soul and the old have a nose for disingenuousness. It's a way and a means by which they perceive. So when our bodies begin the drag downward, it is dispensing away with its capacity for disingenuousness. What leads our bodies downward and inward heightens our personage. The old is more in place within the substratum of the domain of abnormality. We have certain anticipations of our ancestorial figures. At times we may even have unconscious demands from them. Sometimes they may even be unjust and unfair. These states we come to be in relation to the ancestorial spirits of our time go out of order when we neglect the wisdom morphology indicates throughout the body of the aged. Aging has its own importance. It has its own significance. There's a kind of poesy that could only be sensed through the delicate, slow process of aging. It happened once again the other day. Beauty arresting motion in the midst of a busy intersection, the sound of rushing traffic being blotted out by the sound of a flock of parakeets. Nevertheless, the soulful are said to rest less during normal resting cycles when the night falls upon us. Curiously enough, during times when attention is supposed to be paid, it's been said they tend to dream off right in the middle of people's conversation. It's like normal and natural resting cycles somehow got flipped. Spry spirits can lie in and out of consciousness in broad daylight, while the soulful are likely to find some of their most vivid set of apparitions right in the middle of the darkness of the night. As biological years are accumulated, normal resting patterns vary accordingly on their own. They adapt themselves to our increased perceptual acuity. Night becomes the time and space when we intimate best. It's almost as if there's a demand and a refusal to be neglected coming from night. Plenty of activity goes on at night, on it, and in it as well. Aside from memories, recollections, and time spent engaged in establishing communications with a higher being. During the cover of night is when we are supposed to be met with those frightening repressions, suppressions, shame-ridden humilities that suddenly appear. The very same ones that appear to vanish the moment a little bit of daylight breaks. Matters that seem to hold up their own ground more so than the previously just mentioned are beckonings to the restroom. Once again, body finding itself having gone through a natural modification without the need for human modification. Babies aren't bothered in their sleep states by unwilled needs to alleviate the body from its natural inclination. In fact, slightly bigger kids urinate their beds unbothered by the process of alleviation. This need for children to remain deep within sleep is with its own strength. This strength is strong enough to offer protection against the intrusions which cause us to wake from our sleeping slumbers. Slumbers that are so ingrained in us throughout many evolutionary years. The later we get into our biological morphing and its natural occurring morphologies, the more susceptible we are to experiencing some sort of obtrusion to our sleep from our bodies. The sagaciousness of the older body beckons us to arise from our slumber. These waking ups right in the dead of night have their influence in our daily lives as well. When we see evidence of this, when we see evidence of this when we think of how our sustenance intakes or rather, we can see evidence of this when we think of how our sustenance intakes produce natural effects later in the day before they actually occur. The anticipation of causal effects don't give us much choice but to consider what will happen and about when. From what we can tell definitively is that cycles of the day find their way of seeping through processes of the night and likewise the other way around. From a purely physiological standpoint, most of us will succumb to the body's control apparatuses losing control. In effect, we have before us a messaging delivery system saying something like breaking down is a natural process we are capable of controlling, but control will be foregone. Fear is often triggered by the night. It thus requires a different kind of intelligence processing of what causes us dread. In cold cultures, fear initiation rituals are common to bring one into its traditions. Being surrounded by what we fear, sustaining their onslaughts, requires a different kind of character. More so than our bodies heading toward the grave to rot, the more we age, our ideas and notions of what constitutes us is also heading toward its psychological decay. Decomposition, rot, putrefaction, spoil, and mortification are an inevitable part of aging. What if we were to propose that waking up from our sleep brings us up not only in the night but to it as well? In monastic practices, the night was regarded as time to keep watch. Sleep was disrupted intentionally so when vulnerability was at its highest and temptation with its enticements came along, we would be better suited to fend them off. Early Christians desired to do away with sleep altogether. Some groups of individuals still hold today as a belief that certain kinds of powers approach us in our sleep. Revelations 22:5 says, "And there shall be no night there, and they need no candle, neither light of the sun, for the Lord God giveth them light, and they shall reign forever and ever." It says this about the kingdom to come. There's no need to overstate the zealotry which comes about because of religious fanaticism, which is the same kind of zealotry that can be found within any sports fanatics. But banning sleep literally sounds psychotic.